Hey, so welcome to using BroadcastMessage. In this video, we are going to tell you how BroadcastMessage sends down the hierarchy. We'll be creating a natural parent radio system object, creating a new child of player called inner voice, so that we can reduce ourselves to one audio source per game object, and also to play more with the concept of sending messages. Now, you'll probably be thinking that the way that we are handling the audio sources at the moment is a bit of a hack. Well, I think it is. If we look at a couple of our scripts here, do you remember that recently we said that we would find a particular audio source based on its priority? You see here in the player, because we have two audio sources on the player. Well, that's the sort of answer you'll find on a forum on the internet, and that's fine, but it's actually indicative of an architectural issue, and the architectural issue is that we have two different audio sources on this game object. So a slightly different way of showing you things now. I'm going to be using Autodesk Sketchbook, which is a fantastic tool to compare the SendMessage, which you haven't seen yet, which is the most local of these commands. So we're going to look at SendMessage. We're also going to look at SendMessageUpwards again. We've already used SendMessageUpwards. We're just going to revise what that does, and I'll draw you a little picture to explain how I see it visually. And then I'm going to show you BroadcastMessage, which can also be called SendMessageDownwards, although that's not the method name in Unity. It kind of does what you would expect SendMessageDownwards. Okay, so how do these things work? Let me get myself a black pen out. By the way, tell me if you like this style of presentation in the discussions. I'd love to know. So SendMessage, we're going to consider a parent game object with a few child objects here. And I'm also, for SendMessage, going to consider the hierarchy of this game object. So here is the inspector and the hierarchy. So on the right, you have the inspector. So it may have a transform and a renderer, and my script A and my script B, whatever. Okay, all of these different components. And let's consider this game object here. And this is the inspector of that particular game object. Now let's imagine that we use the SendMessage method in here, in one of the scripts on this game object. What does it do? Well, SendMessage will call the script that you specify, like on call helicopter or whatever you call it, whatever event you set up, on all of the other components of this object only, but it is completely local to this game object, okay? The particular one we're on, it only goes across components of the existing game object. So it's very local, and of course with any of these message broadcasting, firstly, don't use them every single frame unless you really need to, and secondly, always use the most local scope you can. That's a general programming truth, if you like. So that's what SendMessage does. Now, what does SendMessageUpwards do? Well, we've already used it, so you've probably got a feeling for what it does. I'm just going to give you more of a diagrammatic feeling for what it does here. Let's say we have 3 levels of nested game objects this time, like so. What SendMessageUpwards does for you is if it's called on this game object, its other components, the script, won't get it. So let's draw the hierarchy for you. The other components won't get it, so here we go. Let's draw a little bit shorter. Leave room for the bottom guy. Skibbity-bippity. So if we call it from this script, these other two don't get it. These other two components don't get it. But what does get the message called is the parent, and then the parent's parent. So all the ancestors. Okay, just as the manual says. And then BroadcastMessage, what does that do? It's probably the least local of all of these because it goes down to all of the child objects. So let's imagine we have 2 levels again nested like that, and we call from here the parent object. It will call all of the children and all of the children's children. So it needs to be used sparingly because it's a very busy little message broadcast. Probably why they call it broadcast, because it's pretty busy. Sends to a lot of different things. Okay, so that's the comparison between a very local send message, a lot less local SendMessageUpwards, and a very global broadcast message. So going to just save that so I can put it in the slides for you later, and get ourselves a new one of these fancy slidey thingies. Tell me whether you like these. As I said in the discussions, I'm really interested. I like being able to sketch and talk. So how are we going to organize then to only have one audio source per game object? Well, we're going to have to change our ecosystem a little bit. So imagine that this now is a radio system which encompasses both the player and the helicopter. So I'm going to put the player in here. Now the player already has a couple of subcomponents. We'll look at those in a moment, but let's put the helicopter in. Now, is this physical? I said I wanted to keep this game as kind of physical as possible. Well, it is. A radio system is distributed between the player and the helicopter. They both have two different sides of the radio system. They have a transceiver each, and then this represents kind of the air or the free space in between them. All right. So how would this look in the hierarchy? Well, it's relatively simple. You would have the helicopter, the radio system number 1 at the top of the hierarchy like that. And then you would have the player, which I'm going to leave some space because we're going to do some other things as well, and the helicopter. So the player would be number 2 in this instance. The helicopter would be number 3. So we have 2 and 3. Now we already have a clear area under the player, remember? We're also going to add a new thing under the player called inner voice. So let's think about where the audio components are. We want the helicopter to only be giving off noise as an audio source. These blue things are audio sources, okay? I'll just call it audio for now. It just wants to give off noise. We don't want it spitting out radio commands. The radio system will be responsible as a 2D for making the transmission sounds as a 2D audio source. This will be a 3D audio source. Now, the player has a couple of different audio sources on him. He has things like footsteps. Now that's a 3D audio source controlled by the first-person character controller so that you and other players can hear your own footsteps. But what we need to do underneath the player now is create one more sub-object called inner voice. Okay, and that's going to be a child object of the player like this. And that's going to be, in terms of numbering here, it's going to be like number 4. Probably use black to be consistent. It'll be a child object of the player called inner voice, and it will have its own audio source on it, and it will I'm just going to call it voice for now, and that will be a 2D because only we need to hear it. Okay, so now we've got 4 different audio sources, as we already do, but now they're split over 4 different game objects. The helicopter makes wacky sounds and things. The player has footsteps, and then off a new sub-object, inner voice, the voice, and then the radio system. And then what we can do is we can start saying, well, when the player wants to send a message to the helicopter, what it can do is it can send a message up to the radio system using SendMessageUpwards, which can then broadcast back down the hierarchy into the helicopter, the radio call. So this type of architecture allows us to have one audio source per game object and to, frankly, exercise or play with the broadcast system more, which is the point. Okay, so I'm going to call this ecosystem and pop it in your slides for you later. Let's go over to Unity now and sort out the audio sources as the end of this lecture. So here we are in Unity. Let's look at the player firstly. The player has 2 audio sources on them. This one here, and then there's one below. Now, which one is being used by the first-person controller? We want to keep that one. What the hell happened? I better call for some. It's the top one, because I saw what happened come here. So I'm going to remove that what happened, or even just copy it. I'll copy it, I think. Copy the component, then remove it, and then I'm going to make this inner voice sub-object. Create inner child, new child, inner voice. I like to put spaces in my game object names. I don't know why. And let's have a script, because we're bound to need that. And then let's have an audio source, so we can paste the component. And then it's going to keep the same properties as before. It's just a 2D audio source at the moment. Not going to configure these yet. I just want to set them up. So the player has one for the footsteps and an inner voice with another, which we will later program for the inner voice. Now, the helicopter also has 2 audio sources, doesn't it? Do we want it to have 2 audio sources? Well, we want it to have a helicopter sound that it plays on awake, but this top audio source, it must be the one we're using for the radio, and we don't want that. So let's remove that. So there's only one 3D audio source on the helicopter. And let's create a new empty game object called radio system. I'm going to reset the transform, it already was, and then child both the player and the helicopter to it. Why? So that we can broadcast messages up and down, as we said. And the radio system itself also needs a script to control it, and it's also going to need an audio source. I'm just going to move the script down because I prefer to have things at the scripts at the bottom. Okay, cool. So this audio source is going to be for the radio, and it's going to be a 2D audio source. So now we have one audio source there, one on the player for the footsteps, another on the player as an inner voice that only the player can hear, and then a helicopter making wacky wacky noises. Okay, fantastic. So now we have set it all up. I'm just going to tidy my scripts away and also address this error message I'm getting. What is the error message? It's saying that the day cycle start rotation is never used, I think is what it said. And also I've got a null reference exception. So let's tidy these up. We will have null reference exceptions because we have removed audio sources. So we'll do that in the next lecture. I just want to sort out the previous warning I had, which was for the day-night cycle. So under day cycle, I have this start rotation. We never used any of that. So I'm just going to get rid of that lot in the day cycle. Okay. And then in the next lecture, we will look at actually refactoring all our code for making this audio work, sending messages up and down the hierarchy, putting the appropriate delays in, recording a few more sounds, etc. Be fun. Okay, see you soon.